by the early part of, let's say, the Common Era, certainly by around 500 or 600, more and more Hinduism, as it was not called back then, more and more Hinduism was focused on personal devotion or worship of three principal figures. Fire sacrifices had no longer at the top of the charts, and people tended to focus on a type of personal devotion to Shiva or Vishnu in various forms, such as Rama and Krishna, or Shakti, the goddess. And in the Puranas especially, it's all about this. It's all about, in fact, the Puranas are often divided in different groups based on whether they're focused on Shiva or Vishnu or Krishna or Rama, or sometimes in the goddess and so on. So we're going to talk a little bit about this devotionalism. Not always devotionalism. It's at first sight, it may look like there were different people in India, and some of them worship Shiva, and some of them worship Vishnu, and some of them worship Shakti, the goddess. And in a sense, that's true. But when you go beneath the surface, they're not so similar. It's not just like they're all doing the same thing, but they have different objects of devotion. It's actually more complex than that, and there are significant differences in what they're really up to. So with that sort of sinister introduction. Anyway, we're going to talk first about the Shaiva side. The word Shiva means auspicious, and the textbook, which you've all read, it mentions how in the earliest Vedic literature, such as the Rig Veda, Shiva is not mentioned by name, although there are hymns to Rudra. And in Hinduism, everyone came to accept that Rudra is Shiva and Shiva is Rudra. And so scholars naturally wonder, was this really the same person or whatever? But in any case, also, as we mentioned earlier, in the Rig Veda, Shiva, or Rudra, I should say, is kind of a dangerous figure. He has to be appeased so that he doesn't hurt you. He's, he can be violent and a little spooky and dangerous. But then Rudra as Shiva, under the name of Shiva, becomes a big hit in Hinduism, becomes a very, very popular deity. And so, of course, you could say from a materialistic academic point of view, you could think about people in South Asia just sort of letting their religious imagination run wild, and then at a certain point they kind of imagine, okay, now there's Shiva. Or from the insiders, from the religious point of view, they would see it that Shiva's always there. He's actually a deity in the universe, and in earlier literature he wasn't understood as well. There's always the idea that there's an original Veda, which was lost to a great extent. That idea is always also there in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 4, where Krishna says that I've come to speak this Gita because the spiritual science has been lost, and that I spoke this actually eons ago to the sun god. And so now I have to revive and restore, reestablish this perennial, this eternal knowledge, which from time to time is lost. So from the insider's point of view, from the point of view of those who actually accept Shiva as a real person, he was always there. It's just that he wasn't understood. And at a certain point, Shiva made himself better understood among people within this Vedic culture. And ultimately, from a true academic point of view, you can't say one point of view or the other is true. In other words, it's not more scholarly to think that people imagine Shiva than it is to think that there really is a Shiva. It's not that one of those views is more scholarly than the other. Mundane scholarship just can't decide that. All we can do is say there's different ways of looking at it. And the idea that skeptical or the skeptical non-believing point of view is somehow more intellectually sophisticated is, of course, ultimately ludicrous if you get into serious philosophical scrutiny of these things. Anyway, so that's what it is. Now, there were different Shiva groups. There's something kind of Gothic about Shiva worship. or there tends to be. It tends to be kind of like the spooky, Gothic. And this gets into an interesting thing. If you look at Middle Eastern traditions, such as Judeo-Christian traditions and sort of more Orthodox Islamic traditions, there's a notion of a transcendent God, a God who's beyond everything, who's the Holy of Holies and so on. And then there's the world down here. In India, and in fact in pagan culture in general, again, this is the best look you'll ever get at old-time paganism, because this is unashamed and largely intact ancient paganism. I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, although to some people it's a pejorative word. So in India, and also in pagan culture before it was persecuted with the rise of Christianity in Europe, there's a tendency to incorporate all aspects of life into quote-unquote religion. In other words, religion is life. It's not that you go to the gym, you go to school, you go out on a date, and then you go to church or something. It's the idea that everything is somehow sacred. Everything is part of a mystic universe. And so at every moment, whatever you're doing. So when I was a kid, there was a popular dance at a certain point when I was very young called the Monster Mash. You ever heard of that? It was a graveyard smash. Anyway, so the Monster Mash and the graveyard smash in Hinduism is actually part of the religion. I mean, this is just sort of a silly example, but still, it illustrates something. And that is that whereas in the West, you have like this very serious, holy atmosphere when you go to a religious place, and then in your free time, you know, when you're on your own, you can do the Monster Mash. It's a graveyard smash. But in India, the Monster Mash and the graveyard smash are part of the religion. Everything is included. So that all those different propensities people have, like let's say to cut their hair in very funny ways or go totally weird and Gothic. I mean, in India, those things were not secular. That wasn't like outside the religion. The religious culture included everything, which partly explains why in cultures like that, there's people didn't rebel so much against religion in general because religion was just life. And no matter how weird you wanted to be, you could do it within the tradition if you wanted to really go out that way. So, and pagan cultures in general like that. So let's talk about these specific things. I want to make the point, this is really like the super Gothic aspect of Hinduism, the Shiva worship. Not exclusively. There are very Orthodox Brahmins, there are very, how would you say, sort of mainstream philosophers and practitioners who worship Shiva, and everyone, to some extent, respects and adores Shiva. But there was a strong tendency. Now, we also talked about the three gunas. Remember that, the three gunas? There was goodness, passion, and ignorance. And so Shiva, ignorance, was supposed to be the destructive power of the universe. So if you go into a fit and start breaking things in your room, you're being affected by the quality of ignorance. When you sort of go on a rampage, you want to tear everything up and break things. And then when you really want to create, you're very ambitious, you want to build and create things, that's said to be passion. And when you're serene and just observing the world, immersed in wisdom, just sort of want to peacefully get along with life, that's goodness, that preservation. So these three qualities are called the three gunas, and Shiva is not said to be himself certainly an ignorant person, but he superintends ignorance, this quality of ignorance. It's under his jurisdiction. In fact, when it's time to destroy the cosmos, it's, that's his cue. And Shiva comes on the scene and tears up the universe. Sometimes he does it by this sort of violent dance of destruction. So it's not a coincidence that at least a certain segment of Shiva worshippers themselves tended to really get into what we might consider some of the darker, spookier modes of nature. Yes?
I'm just wondering, what's the significance between, for like, I know Shiva is like considered like the ultimate aesthetic and but also is it associated with like Tantra and it's like two different spheres of like what's like the significance of that for the
Well, I think it says more about the worshippers of Shiva than about Shiva. There is a very, very common thing in Hinduism that all Hindus know about is a Shiva linga. Linga actually means, among other things, gender or a sign of gender. And so in this case it refers to Shiva's own reproductive organ. And it's, it's worshipped. And it's one of the main things that's worshipped by certain Hindus. And the yoni, the female reproductive thing, the yoni is worshipped Shakti. So this is not a Victorian tradition in one sense. These people are not squeamish about the human anatomy, or even about the anatomies of gods and goddesses. We come from a culture where the body is somehow has all these sort of nasty erotic zones that you look at in magazines or something. So in India, for one thing, it's a tropical country. Most of India is tropical, and people didn't wear that many clothes. So women, for example, in many parts of India, until the advent of European Christian missionaries, it was common, at least in some parts of India, for women not to cover the top of their body. And, scenes like that you can still see in National Geographic magazine, the original soft porn of the United States, even during the conservative 50s. So, anyway, so people, there's traditions. Think back of the Giants where Mahavir, this founder of a new religion, just wanders around naked. It's hard to imagine like a Martin Luther or an Augustine of Hippo, walking around naked. And so it's sort of a very different mood where the body is not seen as bad. There is, in the mainstream Hindu traditions, they are conservative about sexuality in the sense that sexuality is recognized as a very heavy passion that tends to take consciousness away from the pure soul. So becoming aroused in sexual states is definitely seen by mainstream Hinduism as something which is not really compatible with the pursuit of pure consciousness. But the body itself is, you see there's so many sculptures on the outsides of temples of which are quite explicit, of males and females sometimes engaged in intimate situations. And and again, the Shiva linga and the yoni of Shakti, it's interesting because in many ways India has been sexually conservative at different times. Not everyone. There's these, of course, ritual tantric sex, or trying to arouse the sexual energy and then restrain it, channel it, and so on. There's all this tantra, but in general, mainstream Hinduism has been somewhat conservative, like other parts of the world, in terms of premarital sex and extramarital sex and so on. And yet they're not so squeamish about the human body. The human body is just sort of what it is. And so that's one significant difference. Anyway, the Pashupatas, just the names of these different Shiva groups say something. Pashupata comes from the Sanskrit word pashu, which means animal or beast, and pati means lord. So Pashupati is the name of Shiva, which means lord of the beasts or lord of the animals. And there's even some ancient seals which are interpreted that way from Harappa. In any case, Pashupata means the followers of Pashupati, in which the individual soul is called Pashu, the beast. And the Lord is Pashupati, the Lord of the beasts. And so it's kind of a certain flavor to it, where souls are beasts. Anyway, so in the development of this Pashupata group, they, for example, this is very typical smearing ashes on your body ritualistically. Shiva is often worshipped in crematoriums. Again, it's pretty spooky and, a little dark. And antinomian, public behavior, nomos in Greek means law. And so antinomian means where you it's sort of like a super hippie thing where you intentionally break the rules. So that, that's called antinomian behavior. Period of antinomian public behavior such as speaking gibberish and lewdly gesturing to women. So somehow lewdly gesturing to women was a religious practice in some people's minds. And those who scorned them would end up absorbing the Pashupata's bad karma and relinquish their own merits. So this is kind of, anyway, it's hard not to express my own view of such things. The idea is you go out in public and you sort of outrage people, either by making obscene gestures, just really getting out of control, outrage people, and when they become outraged, they suck up all your bad karma. And then you get their good karma, and then you sort of rip them off and then take off and eat my karma, buddy, go. And I get your good karma, and it's like, I mean, I think there is something profoundly ignorant about this. But somehow or other, again, that's my opinion, but that is my opinion. First of all, sort of exploiting other people. It reminds me even of one aspect of the Jain Dharma, where the Jain monks couldn't cook because then you might kill a bacteria or microbe or something, and so forth. Therefore, you induce the married people to cook, so they have to eat the karma, and you just get the karma-free food, and everybody's happy. Or something like that. So this idea of dumping your stuff, it's almost like you have all this, let's say, radioactive waste, you just dump it in your neighbor's yard. You just dump all your trash on your neighbor's lawn, so your lawn looks really nice and all the trash is on his side of the fence. It's just, there's something that I don't quite get about that. So there were, the Pashupatas gave rise to the Kalamukas. Who had a crescent moon, forehead ornament, dark ash-smeared face or forehead. The Kalamukas smeared themselves in the ashes of corpses. We're gonna, by the way, I'm gonna have a demonstration of this at the end of the class. So both groups flourished in South India between the 7th and 14th centuries, and they even had temples. Then there's the Kapalikas. From the word kapala, which means a skull. So they would have a staff with a skull on it. So like, smearing yourself in the ashes of corpses, outraging people in public so you can dump your trashy karma on them, and then walking around with a human, skull and everything. I told you it was Gothic. And again, it's not unrelated to the fact that Shiva is in charge of the mode of ignorance. And so he tended to attract a certain clientele. Let's see. What's the thing? In the Puranic version of the myth of Shiva's decapitation of Brahma's 5th head. So Brahma had 5 heads, as we all know. Today, Brahma only has 4 heads. So Shiva cut off the 5th head. Why do you do that? Well, I don't know. He must have a good reason. But since Brahma is the original Brahman, cutting off a Brahman's head is kind of like not a good thing to do. So to expiate the karma of this deed, Shiva is forced to wander penitently for 12 years in what is known as great ascetic observance until Brahma's skull, Kapala, which has adhered to his hand, is released. So Shiva cuts off Brahma's head, and Brahma's skull gets stuck to Shiva's hand. So he has to wander for 12 years so he can drop this skull. So similarly, I'm not saying these things really ever happen, but this attracted certain people. The myth resonates with the practices of Shaivite ascetics, such as the Lakulas and Kapalikas who wore ornaments. Ornaments, and those of you who are looking for a new way, to stand out at the next party you go to, ornaments of bone and carried a renouncer's bowl fashioned from a human skull. These groups disappeared as coherent sects, but still endure the practices of less clearly categorized Shaivite ascetics. Then there were the Nayanars. The Nayanars were sort of bhakti poets. They were the equivalent in Tamil Nadu, Southeast India, of the Alwars, who were the Vaishnava poets. So these were just, yes?
Was that Brahma the creator?
Yeah. Yeah, decapitated the creator. So, the Nayanars are, but then even here, the extreme devotion gets into kind of grisly manifestations. I mean, two of which were mentioned in the book, which I hope you didn't read over breakfast or lunch. So the Nayanars, their songs were passionate and promoted egalitarianism, which sounds like a good thing, that challenged orthodox hierarchies. They're known for extreme devotion. Legend has it that one of the Nayanars, Kannapar, once noticed that the eyes on the Shiva Linga he was worshipping were bleeding. So he had a Shiva Linga. He noticed it had eyes on it. Sometimes they put little, eyes and nose or mouth on these little worship objects. So he noticed the eyes were bleeding. So what did he do? He plucked out his own eyes to replace them. Do not try this at home. So he plucked out his own eyes because he saw the eyes on his linga were bleeding as an act of extreme devotion. Similarly, Chirutontar was once asked by a wandering Shaivite to cook up and serve his own son as a food offering. So if you're asked by a wandering sage to cook and serve your own son as a food offering, you do it, right? Well, anyway, he did so immediately in a display of absolute obedience and devotion. In both cases, Shiva appeared, praised his devotees, and restored their losses. So Kannapar got his eyes back, and Chirutontar got his son back. Of course, it reminds us of the Old Testament where, God tells Abraham to offer Isaac in sacrifice, and as a sign of absolute obedience. It does make you wonder. Any questions on these points? Yes.
So is it Shiva asking for these strange offerings, or is it just more so like the...
Well, these are reports. These are reports from certain worshippers who claim that this is...
But in either case, he still restores whatever, gross offering they make, right?
Yes. In these stories, yes. Cooking your own son, though, let's say, for example, you had a relationship with someone who claimed to be totally devoted to you and you wanted to test their love. And so you asked them to cook their child and serve it. It's, I can't help thinking there might be more pleasant ways to test the love of someone with whom you're in a relationship. It's just a little, anyway, I can't say, that's just my own view. It's a bit grisly, and I think it says something about the culture that it comes from, or the people that are telling these stories, that would be cooking your own child, because as a sign of obedience, because then you could imagine people saying, well, okay, I want to prove my love for Shiva. They'll cook my child, and what if Shiva doesn't restore him, shrink wrapped on the shelf? So, anyway, what's interesting, as Krishna points out in the Gita, I want to bring out something that Krishna says about all this. One second. And that is in the Gita, Krishna says that there is people who worship in these three modes of nature. So the people in the mode of ignorance will come up with their own approach to worship and religion. People in the mode of passion and people in the mode of goodness. And so, as Krishna points out, that these different modes of worship reflect the qualities of consciousness of the worshippers. Again, that's psychological interpretation. Yes, do you have a question?
I was just wondering, are most of the followers of, that worship Shiva and Shakti, are they the Kshatriya class?
Not necessarily. Sort of general worship. Yes?
I heard about this one sect of modern India. It's they don't eating corpses if they get from the Ganges.
Oh my
Do you know what sect that is?
No, I haven't had the pleasure of looking into that. Yes?
Is it possible to attain moksha in any of the gunas, or do you have to get to the goodness?
Generally, one has to progress to the mode of goodness, and because, what's that? I think it would be looked at more that passion is a corruption of goodness, and ignorance is even a further corruption. It's like if you take an original light and let's say you put a cloth in front of it so some light comes through, and then you keep blocking the light until no light comes through. So the idea of balancing, the idea that one should have a healthy amount of ignorance in one's character, or a healthy amount of passion. The way these, the classic description of these qualities, of course, is in the Bhagavad Gita. And the way Krishna describes passion is as a type of sort of rational selfishness. In other words, to give an example, let's say someone in the mode of ignorance feels strong lust and therefore satisfies that lust just by going out and grabbing someone. Someone in the mode of ignorance without any consideration of communicable diseases, without any consideration even perhaps of the will of the other person, just any kind of future consequences, emotional or physical or social, simply tries to gratify their desire. And in the mode of passion, someone still has this lust, but tries to satisfy it, let's say, with a proper marriage. And then in goodness, one comes to a higher state of consciousness, and actually one's desires become spiritual, one's desires become focused on the soul and on virtue and goodness, and so there really isn't this lust to satisfy, because one is in a different state of consciousness. So the idea of balancing them, that's also the Gita gives a picture where in this world, trying to sort of connect to what you're saying, in this world, all three modes are present. So that every one of us, sometimes we have our really irrational moments. Sometimes we get in our really ugly moods, in which it's better, for people not to sort of talk to us, or like, I think I better talk to you later because I'm really in an ugly mood right now. And when we just sort of become irrational or nasty, and then sometimes we feel very ambitious. Sometimes we're simply serene. We're simply sort of at peace with life, and we're more into a deep understanding of things. And so still the idea is to come to ultimately purified goodness, Shuddha Sattva, where one is free of all the material qualities. In fact, transcendence, according to the Gita and other texts, is to transcend all three qualities. Now the balance, you could say, is there in the sense that to the extent that one is conditioned by these three qualities, one has to find a way, sort of healthy ways to engage these qualities without damaging oneself spiritually. But still, the goal is always to realize the pure soul who's beyond these qualities. Anything else? Yes.
Maybe it's like tangential. I don't know. The impression I got from reading the Gita was that everything in the universe is composed of the demons. Like that's just a manifest world.
Yeah, what is that verse? Natarasti prativyang va divi deveshu va puna sattam prakritijaya muktam. Yeah, there's no creation in this world that's free of these qualities, but the pure soul is beyond them. And so the idea, therefore, is to realize that I shouldn't identify with anything in this universe. I'm just visiting here. I'm just sort of in transit within this universe, and my real nature is beyond everything, every creation. And the soul, of course, being uncreated, having always existed. Yes?
Is it pure soul? Seeing the pure soul is the same as seeing Brahman?
Yes. Yeah, the pure soul is Brahman or Atman. And then, as Arjuna states in chapter 11, Krishna, or God, is the Parang Brahman, the supreme Brahman. So that there's an absolute truth, and then there are individual souls. And this is emphasized throughout the Gita. Now, it's actually very nice you brought that up, because I wanted to mention the Shaiva Siddhanta. The word Siddhanta is just a Siddha. If you know the word Siddhi, like in yoga, Siddhis, perfections. So Siddha means perfected or established or concluded, and Anta, end. So final conclusion or perfection. So Shaiva Siddhanta is a group which began in North India and involved with certain tantric practices and other things. And then migrated to South India, disappeared in North India, and still exists in South India. They have their three P's: the Lord, Pati, souls, Pashu, again, beasts, and Pasha, the noose, which binds them, meaning illusion. There's one thing: the Lord Shiva is both transcendent yet immanent in all aspects of creation. As Sadashiva, out of pure playfulness, he emits the world, maintains it, reabsorbs the world, conceals himself, and reveals himself through grace. So a world in which there's so much suffering as there is in this world, I mean, my God, just read the media or don't read it, but there's an incredible amount of suffering going on, and so to describe this as pure playfulness is an interesting take on it. To say that the suffering of people in this world is just sort of an act of God's playfulness. It seems that somehow the suffering of others is a little more serious than that. Anyway, so what's interesting about this Shaiva Siddhanta is that ultimately, upon liberation, Shiva reveals himself and the soul eventually realizes its pure state as equal to Shiva, although it does not become Shiva, the Lord. Now, there is a group claiming to be a Shaiva Siddhanta group, that's what they call themselves, the Shaiva Siddhanta Church. They're based in Hawaii, of course, comes from an Indian guru. And in fact, this Indian guru, Subramanian Swami, with whom I've had a little contact, he publishes a very popular newspaper called Hinduism Today. It's read by many Hindus. Anyway, they're on one of those islands out in Hawaii. And claim to be Shaiva Siddhanta. This is from their website, actually. They say that, I thought you'd enjoy this. Let's see, that the goal of Shaiva Siddhanta, is complete and irrevocable merger. That's the word they use, merger. It's not a corporate merger. Here it's me. The complete and irrevocable merger of the soul with God. The Jiva becomes Shiva. So obviously there's some diversity of opinion, because in our book it said that the Shaiva Siddhanta thinks that you become equal to Shiva, but not Shiva, almost like the morality of divine physics, also becomes Shiva. And one of the most prominent Shaiva Siddhanta in the West, in fact they published Hinduism Today, outside of India, claiming that the Jiva, the soul, the individual soul, becomes Shiva. A complete and irrevocable merger, to use their word. So, what I wanted to contrast this with the Vaishnav side, which is tended to be historically much more strictly monotheistic, and that there is one supreme personal God. And on the Vaishnav side, really there would be no question of saying that you merge into God, you become God. This distinction is always maintained, that we are eternal servants of God or associates of God, but God is always supreme, Krishna or Rama or Narayan, Vishnu, and so on. And so it is on the Vaishnav side that theologically and just devotionally, they've tended to maintain a much more strict distinction that although we are one with God in a sense, if you think of the Vedanta traditions, one of the greatest Vaishnava thinkers was Ramanuja, who his philosophy was called Vishishtadvaita, that there is a non-dualism, there's a oneness, but with distinctions. In other words, we are one with God, but at the same time, God is always supreme. And we are always subordinate to God, even as we are one with God. And so, the Shaiva groups, at least the intellectual part of the Shaiva communities and the Vaishnava communities, definitely got involved in the Vedanta debates and tended to take positions. And on the Shaiva side, because the consort, the female counterpart, or the wife of Shiva has always been understood to be Shakti, this goddess, we'll talk about Shaktism, which is somehow associated with Shaivism. But if you think about normal psychology, for some people, their father is let's say, most important influence in their life. For some people, their mother is most influential. For some people, it's both their mother and their father. So in a civilization where there's all this freedom and all this variety, and again, you find this throughout other pagan civilizations, including Greco-Roman civilization, before Europe was purified of that paganism. What you find is that some people really are moved by, inspired by, and devote themselves to the mother figure, the goddess. And so this is in fact, it's said that the worship of the goddess, the worship of the Divine Mother, in India is the most systematic, the most sophisticated manifestation of something which you find all around the world. Even in Christianity, of course, early on, they came up with their own goddess worship in the form of the Virgin Mary. And there are also people who are very intrigued by Mary Magdalene and so on. So if you think of the Virgin Mary, this very much this goddess mother figure, because if you look at the early demographics of the Jesus movement, it very quickly shifted from a movement based in Israel in which all the followers were Jews, and the Romans understood the Jesus movement to be a Jewish movement. It didn't really differentiate itself until a few generations after Jesus. And so, but then as the Jesus movement gradually becomes composed of former pagans, people who before they joined the movement had been pagans, and I think it's not a coincidence that these people who were attached to the worship of the goddess, mother figure, came up with a goddess in early Christianity, in the form of the Virgin Mary. Now, I don't mean to say that she's not a goddess. I'm simply saying that you see how, coming from this pagan culture, it became very prominent. In fact, and not only Mary, there's also, for example, Cecilia. I mean, many of you probably no longer worship Saint Cecilia. But in the 17th century in Europe, and perhaps earlier, Saint Cecilia was accepted as the patron saint, the goddess of artists in Europe. In other words, people that composed music, that played music, people that wrote poetry, artists. The artsy community back then during the Renaissance, their goddess was Cecilia. And every year around Europe, different countries, they would have a St. Cecilia's Day festival. So that, for example, in England, the greatest poets would be commissioned to write hymns in praise of Cecilia. The greatest composers would put it to music, and they would have an artist festival in which part of the proceeding was a sacred service, worshiping St. Cecilia. If you're interested in Baroque music, by the way, Henry Purcell, considered the greatest English composer of the 17th century, twice composed the music, and especially it's actually very exquisite. If you get a chance to listen to Purcell's St. Cecilia Day music. Anyway, so if you think about it, when you're brought up, most people that are brought up, your mother is an extremely important influence on you, your first real love, your first really strong emotional attachments to your mother. I don't mean to say, this is not a psychological theory of goddess worship. I'm not at all saying that people imagine there's a goddess because of their early attachments to their mother. That's not what I'm saying. It may just as well be, for all we know, that the world's created in such a way that we do become attached to our mother, because that reflects ultimately a cosmic reality in which there actually are goddesses. And so again, I don't mean to favor one side or the other. This is not a psychological reductionistic argument. I'm simply saying that in real life, the role of the female, the role of the mother, is extremely important. And it's actually the attachment to one's mother, and I would say in healthy people, is one of the most fundamental building blocks of healthy human consciousness. And so in these cultures, like in Hindu culture, the female was extremely important. In fact, you tend to find the absolute truth conceived of as a divine couple, so that it's really not just Ram, it's Sita Ram. And the whole worship of Ram is really Sita Ram. And they really are a couple, and they really are always together, and they're always generally pictured together. Or Krishna is Radha Krishna. Krishna is kind of like the original teenager in love, and his teenage girlfriend is Radha. And so if you go to Vrindavan, where Krishna grew up, a typical greeting in the street, people sort of greet each other, is Jai Radhe, which sort of means like glory, like Radhe, to Radha. And so, in fact, you see it painted. Some I guess, pious person has taken it upon himself to paint these words, Jai Radhe, in the Devanagari alphabet. You see it all over Vrindavan. It's on every wall. It's everywhere. Oops, a little rusty here. Jai Radhe. So You see this everywhere, and that's the greeting. Jai Radhe. It's not Jai Krishna, it's Jai Radhe. So the female figure is extremely important. I mean, it's someone might argue that there's something healthy about this. I mean, someone who, let's say, is blessed in their childhood with a good mother and a good father, and sincerely becomes attached, lovingly attached to a good mother and a good father. It seems like I think psychology would definitely confirm this is the healthiest way to go. If you have a positive, healthy, loving relationship with a good mother and father, that's really the best thing. And so in terms of spiritual consciousness, cosmic consciousness, this concept where the absolute truth is conceived of as a perfect and pure male and female is it's been a very stable concept. It's been a very stable concept, and for many people, historically, it's been a very satisfying one. And it actually roots paternity and maternity in this world in a divine model. In other words, like you have a statement by Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita that Pitahamasya Jagato, I'm the father of this world, Mata, and the mother. I'm the father of this world and the mother. And so the father and mother become actually sacred figures. They become representatives of a supreme father and a supreme mother. So that the whole universe becomes sort of like a little cosmic family. And there really is very much this intimate sense of the universe. The Greeks had this. The word cosmos is actually cognate with the word cosmetic. If you think of cosmetic, which means something which beautifies. And so cosmos was a sense of the universe as a beautiful harmony. And there really is this sense of the universe as an intimate, cosmic, extended family. And ultimately, when we become liberated, we rejoin our eternal family. So it's all very personal. Now, of course, from a skeptical point of view, this is all sort of shameless anthropomorphism. And from the point of view of those who accept this, it actually is the supreme harmony and coherence and unity of the universe. That the feelings we have in this world, even in a limited, imperfect way, actually are revealing the ultimate nature of reality. So that rather than reject our human experiences are actually pointing to a higher reality. And so liberation doesn't mean to radically reinvent yourself as something totally different than what you are now, but rather to refine and purify yourself so you just become sort of a super pure, enlightened version of what you are now. So there's something very accepting in this, accepting of who you are and saying that you're not bad as a person, even as a human person, as someone that falls in love, as someone that appreciates beauty. It's simply that you have to do this in an enlightened way, in a more thoroughly spiritual way, and because that's who you ultimately really are. So that's, I think, at the heart of this way of looking at reality. That's what it looks like to people who are within this belief system. Any questions on any of that? Yes?
This belief system, which belief system?
Oh, this bhakti, devotional idea. Again, on the Shaiva side, you eventually become Shiva. For some Shaiva people, you eventually become Shiva. No, equal to Shiva, not Shiva. And then for the Shaiva Siddhanta Church in Hawaii, there's a complete and irrevocable merger. So that Jiva becomes Shiva. But in the more pure bhakti traditions, and by pure bhakti I mean that there's devotion to a personal deity which does not become suspended or transcended later. It's not that now you're devoted to Shiva, but then down the road, as you find in many Shaiva groups, down the road, that form of Shiva, the human-like form holding a trident or whatever he's holding, that sort of dissolves, and there's just some kind of impersonal energy. So that there were people who followed Shankara. By the way, Shankara is the name of Shiva. It's Shiva means auspicious, and Shankara. Any room here? Shang is another word for well-being, and Kara means making. So literally being beneficial. Shankara. So there were people who worshiped Shiva who also philosophically studied Shankara, and so they developed these Shaiva schools, which were very common, in which at a certain point the figure, the personal form of Shiva or Shakti to which you devoted yourself dissolves, and there's just an impersonal energy. On the Vaishnava side, they tended to be much more strict about devotion, that now we are devoted to Krishna or Rama or Narayan, and we will eternally be devoted. It's an eternal love and eternal devotion. It's not something which disintegrates at a certain point. Yes?
So the Vaishnavas are also Shaktas because they're worshipping like...
No, the Shaktas, the people that worship Shiva also worship Shakti. Everyone appreciates Shakti. In fact, from the Vaishnava side, Radha, the consort of Krishna, or Sita, the consort of Ram, would be seen as the original source of Shakti, who was the wife of Shiva. So the idea is that there's a supreme male, eternal male figure, a supreme female, and all the males and females kind of emanate from this original divine couple. And in the Shakta side, they emphasize that Shakti is the real power, and that Shiva, for example, is sort of inert or kind of, apathetic until he combines with Shakti. It's like a guy who's morose until his girlfriend gets back in town. So that's the idea that that Shakti, if you think of the word Shakti, power, energy, that even for the male, it's the female that really energizes and inspires and enlivens the man. And of course there's some truth in it. So there's no other question? We'll end here.